My name is Victoria Crawford, and I was 28 the afternoon I sat in my late grandfather's freezing truck, holding a forged quitclaim deed with my name on it. Through the speakers of my phone, my father was leaving his third voicemail of the hour. His voice was sharp and impatient, telling me he was out of sympathy and that if I did not sign the waiver by morning, he would call the county sheriff to have me escorted off the ranch. He said I was trespassing on his land. He said I was embarrassing the family. I did not hit reply. I just traced my thumb over the blue ink of the signature he had tried to fake. As a corporate contract analyst, I spent my days dissecting liability clauses and breach penalties. I read ink the way a tracker reads mud. The letter V was hesitant and pressed too hard into the paper. The loop of the C betrayed a nervous tremor. It was my father's penmanship, disguised poorly. A normal daughter might have broken down right there in the rain. She might have screamed at the windshield, shattered by the realization that her own blood had stolen her inheritance and fabricated legal documents to throw her off the property her grandfather built. I just reached into the cup holder and picked up an old tin coffee mug. I had filled it from the kitchen tap before slipping out the back door. I took a slow sip of the cold water. 2 days earlier, my father Richard and my stepmother Brenda had transferred the entirety of Grandfather John's liquid estate to my stepbrother Tyler. They gave away my $500,000 share because Tyler had debts and needed a second chance. I had received a layoff notice from my corporate firm that exact same week. Nobody cared. They believed they had backed a defeated, unemployed daughter into a corner. What they did not realize was that by forging this specific document and attempting to lease the surrounding acreage to private developers, they had just triggered an irrevocable legal trap my grandfather set for this exact moment. Welcome back to Morning Revenge, where we tell quiet stories about ordinary women who keep their dignity when the people closest to them decide to turn. If you have ever been the responsible one pushed aside for a golden child, drop your age in the comments. And be sure to subscribe. This story proves that the loudest people in the room usually own the least. The fracture happened on a Tuesday. The email from Human Resources terminating my analyst position arrived at 9 in the morning. At noon, Richard and Brenda requested a mandatory video call. I answered from my kitchen table. My father refused to look directly at the webcam, shifting his eyes to the corner of his screen. Brenda sat beside him, holding a glass of orange juice and champagne. Richard cleared his throat and explained that the probate lawyer had found a flexibility clause regarding the liquid assets. He said Tyler was struggling emotionally and financially. He said family protects family, so they were redirecting my portion of the cash to him. They did not ask for my blessing. They informed me of a transaction that was already complete. I did not mention my job loss. My mind immediately categorized the conversation as a breach of contract rather than a wound. I watched Brenda take a sip of her drink, waiting for me to cry or plead. When I stayed perfectly silent, the discomfort on their end of the call became palpable. I told them I understood the situation and closed my laptop. The next afternoon, Tyler arrived at my apartment complex in a brand new $90,000 lifted truck. The paint was pristine and the tires had never touched dirt. He claimed he came to help me pack my things, but his real goal was to gloat. He leaned against my kitchen counter with manicured hands, complaining about his failed software startup and saying the inheritance was a real lifesaver. I watched him pick up a small cardboard box and groan about the weight. He represented everything my grandfather despised. John Crawford built a cattle empire with calloused hands and early mornings. He measured worth by grit and self-reliance. Tyler measured his by luxury car payments. While Tyler turned his back to answer a phone call, I noticed a leather portfolio sitting open on his jacket. Inside was a financing agreement for his new truck and a printed ledger of private loans. I quietly pulled my phone from my pocket and photographed the pages. I heard him tell someone on the call that the Montana lease was a done deal and the investors would get their money by Friday. A cash injection of $500,000 would not save a man carrying the kind of debt I saw on those pages. Tyler was hiding a catastrophic liability, and he intended to use the family land to pay for it. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and grabbed my car keys. It was time to go back to Big Sky Country. The morning the fracture became permanent began with a sterile email from Human Resources. My position as a senior contract analyst was eliminated, effective immediately due to corporate restructuring. I spent 3 years at that firm dissecting indemnification clauses and liability waivers. My entire career revolved around holding people accountable for the promises they signed. When corporate entities tried to slip predatory clauses into merger documents, I was the person who caught them. I spent thousands of hours analyzing the exact phrasing of liability shifts and penalty triggers. I read fine print the way a predator watches the tree line. I understood the cold architecture of legal agreements better than anyone else in my department. The severance package they offered me was minimal. My bank account was thin, but I did not panic. 3 hours later, a calendar notification appeared on my phone screen. The event was titled Family Update. The organizer was my stepmother, Brenda. My father, Richard, never scheduled digital meetings. He was a man who preferred quick text messages or total avoidance. A formal invitation meant Brenda was orchestrating a performance. I opened my laptop and joined the video lobby. When the screen connected, I saw them sitting at their staged dining room table in the suburbs. The room was a monument to superficial wealth. Brenda had decorated it with cheap modern art and fragile glass centerpieces. It was a sharp contrast to the rugged timber and stone of the Montana ranch my grandfather John built. My father wore a pressed golf shirt. He kept shifting in his seat, refusing to look directly into the camera lens. His gaze darted to the window, to his coffee cup, to his hands. Richard was a man who spent his entire life trying to buy the approval of people who looked down on him. He married Brenda because she projected an image of country club status. He spent decades bending to her will because he feared conflict more than he valued integrity. Brenda sat next to him wearing an expensive cashmere sweater. She held a tall crystal glass filled with orange juice and champagne. It was barely noon on a Tuesday. Richard cleared his throat and rubbed the back of his neck. He started talking about the burden of being the executor of an estate. He talked about changing economic times and the rising cost of living. He used broad, empty phrases that politicians use when they are about to steal something. I sat quietly in my apartment, listening to him avoid the truth. Brenda placed a manicured hand over his arm, stopping his nervous rambling. She looked right into the camera. She used the soft, patronizing tone of a terrible therapist. She said Tyler was navigating a challenging season. Tyler is my stepbrother. Brenda brought him into the family when he was 15. He was currently 30 years old and still sending his laundry out to be washed. Tyler had never held a job for more than 6 months. He was the golden child who failed upward. When he crashed his first car, Richard bought him a new one. When he dropped out of college, Brenda blamed the professors. His entire life was a series of challenging seasons funded by other people. Brenda explained that Tyler had accumulated investor debts from his latest software startup. The application had failed before it even launched. She said the family needed to protect him from ruthless creditors. She told me, family protects family. Then my father finally looked at the screen and delivered the blow. He said they were using the executor flexibility clause in the probate documents to redirect my $500,000 share of the liquid estate to Tyler. They were giving away my inheritance. My grandfather, John Crawford, left that money for me. He promised it to me the day I graduated with my degree. He was a man who built a cattle empire from nothing. His hands were thick with calluses, and he smelled of dry pine and engine oil. He measured a person by their grit and their ability to endure hard work. He despised the weak, flashy consumption that Brenda and Tyler represented. But John left the initial administration of the estate to his only son. He trusted Richard to do the right thing. That was his fatal mistake. I stared at the screen. A normal person would have screamed. A normal daughter would have cried and begged them to reconsider. I could have told them I lost my job that very morning. I could have explained that my rent was due and the severance would barely cover 2 months of groceries. I could have used guilt. Instead, my mind shifted gears. The daughter faded away, and the contract analyst took over. I recognized the executor flexibility clause my father mentioned. It was a standard provision designed to let the administrator cover unexpected funeral expenses or lingering medical bills for the estate. It was not a blank check to defund one heir to save another. By draining my designated share to pay off Tyler, he was committing a textbook breach of fiduciary duty. The betrayal was cold, but my reaction was colder. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice. I leaned closer to the microphone and asked a single clarifying question. I asked if the wire transfer had already been initiated. Richard blinked, surprised by my calm tone. He nodded and said the funds cleared the bank an hour ago. He said he hoped I could understand why they had to make this sacrifice. He said I was strong and smart, and I always figured things out on my own. It was the coward's way of apologizing. He was weaponizing my independence to justify his theft. Brenda took a sip of her drink and offered a tight, patronizing smile. She said she knew I would be the bigger person. She said we could all get together for dinner around the holidays to celebrate Tyler getting back on his feet. I told them to enjoy their afternoon. I reached out and closed the laptop. The screen went black, cutting off their staged performance. The silence in my apartment was heavy. I stood up and walked to my bedroom closet. The sting of the betrayal was sharp, but anger is a useless emotion if it lacks a strategic direction. They thought I was a naive girl who would simply accept the loss and struggle in silence. They assumed my quiet demeanor meant I surrendered. They did not understand that silence is the optimal environment for gathering data. I pulled a dark canvas duffel bag from the top shelf. I did not pack for a vacation. I packed for a forensic audit. I folded 3 sharp blazers, rigid denim jeans, and heavy boots. I went to the kitchen and grabbed my grandfather's battered tin coffee mug. It was the only physical item of his I kept in my apartment. The metal was dented from years of riding on the dashboard of his truck. I placed it carefully in the bag. My father and Brenda were short-sighted. They looked at $500,000 in cash and thought they had secured the greatest prize in the estate. They viewed wealth through the lens of instant gratification. They did not understand the deep generational power of Big Sky Country. They did not realize that in Montana, liquid cash was just paper. True wealth was written in the dirt, the timber, and the water. The theft of my inheritance was not the end of the story. It was the inciting incident. It was the catalyst that freed me from any remaining obligation to act like an obedient daughter. If they wanted to rewrite the rules of my grandfather's legacy, they would have to face someone who knew how to read the fine print. I zipped the duffel bag shut. I needed to know exactly how deep Tyler had dug his grave. A failed software startup might cost $50,000. It does not cost $500,000. If Tyler needed that much cash injected into his accounts immediately, he was hiding something much worse than a bad business plan. I needed his financial records. I needed to see the numbers he was keeping in the dark. I walked out the door and locked my apartment. I did not know yet that Tyler would deliver the evidence right to my front steps the very next afternoon. I did not know he would be foolish enough to drive a $90,000 mistake into my parking lot and leave his secrets sitting on the passenger seat. All I knew as I walked to my car was that the war had started and I was going to finish it. The roar of a modified diesel engine vibrated through the thin glass of my living room window. I stood by the kitchen island folding a stack of legal reference manuals into a cardboard carton. I walked to the blinds and looked down at the asphalt parking lot. A jet black custom lifted truck dominated 2 parking spaces. The chrome rims caught the midday sun, reflecting a blinding glare. The suspension rode impossibly high above the pavement. The tires were thick and pristine, lacking a single speck of mud or dust. It was a vehicle designed to project rugged dominance to people who had never swung a hammer or mended a fence. The driver door swung open, and Tyler climbed down. He wore a designer bomber jacket and wire-rimmed aviator sunglasses. He was my stepbrother, the golden child, who never heard the word no. Brenda brought him into our lives when he was a teenager, and my father, Richard, immediately began funding his mistakes. Tyler walked with a distinct swagger. It was the confident stride of a man who knew someone else would always cover the check. He carried 2 iced coffees from an overpriced boutique cafe down the street, swinging them casually as he approached my building. A few minutes later, a sharp knock echoed on my door. I pulled the handle back to find him leaning against the frame. He offered one of the plastic cups to me with a rehearsed, sympathetic smile. He said he heard the unfortunate news about my job and wanted to come over to help me pack. He claimed family needed to stick together during hard times. He used the exact same empty platitudes Brenda had utilized on the video call the previous afternoon. I stepped aside and let him enter the apartment. He set the beverages on the counter and removed his sunglasses. As he reached out, his left sleeve pulled back, revealing a heavy platinum timepiece on his wrist. I recognized the specific chronograph model from my days working with senior corporate partners. That specific accessory retailed for more than $15,000. I shifted my gaze to his hands. His fingernails were perfectly buffed. The skin on his palms was smooth, unblemished, and soft. John Crawford would have taken one look at those hands and refused to hire him to sweep a barn floor. Tyler walked over to a half-filled box of winter sweaters. He lifted the flaps, tested the weight, and dramatically exhaled. He complained about his lower back acting up from the stress of his recent software venture. He dropped the box back onto the floor and leaned against the painted drywall. The physical labor was over before it even began. He took a sip of his beverage and shifted his eyes to the floorboards, attempting to mimic guilt. He told me he felt terrible about the inheritance reallocation. He spun a narrative about the investors from his app development company threatening to ruin his credit score. He claimed the $500,000 was a vital lifeline that barely kept him out of bankruptcy court. He thanked me for being so understanding about the financial sacrifice. He spoke with the smooth cadence of a practiced liar. I watched him perform his little act. My contract analyst brain ran a silent, relentless calculation. A citizen facing imminent financial ruin does not drive a $90,000 custom vehicle with a $2,000 monthly finance payment. A business owner drowning in legitimate startup obligations does not wear a luxury chronograph or purchase frivolous boutique drinks. The math was broken. The story he and Brenda sold my father was a calculated fiction. $500,000 in liquid cash was not a rescue package for a failing tech product. It was a temporary bandage on a much deeper structural wound. Before I could interrogate his logic, his cell phone rang. The sharp electronic tone pierced the quiet room. Tyler glanced at the screen, and his relaxed posture vanished instantly. His shoulders stiffened. The color drained from his cheeks. He quickly set his cup down and patted his denim pockets. He pulled the device out and hit the answer button, spinning around to face the street window. He walked toward the far corner of the living room, pressing the speaker tight to his ear. He had draped his designer bomber jacket over the back of my dining chair when he first walked inside. As he paced near the glass pane, speaking in a hushed, frantic whisper, I moved silently toward the furniture. I am not a thief by nature, but analyzing risk requires gathering leverage. I noticed a thick, folded envelope protruding from the inner breast pocket of the garment. The heavy paper bore the distinctive watermark of a private equity lending firm based in Chicago. I slid the envelope out using just 2 fingers. The parchment was crisp and new. I unfolded it flat on the dining table, keeping my peripheral vision locked on Tyler's back. It was a preliminary loan agreement. I pulled my smartphone from my back pocket and opened the camera application. I disabled the flash. I took 3 clear, high-resolution photographs of the text, capturing the lender names, the repayment terms, and the signature lines at the bottom. While the lens recorded the evidence, my ears tuned into Tyler's distant conversation. His vocal pitch was rising in uncontrolled panic. He told the unseen caller to calm down and check the incoming wire transfers. He stated the $500,000 cleared the bank routing system that morning. The response he received must have contained a severe threat because Tyler dropped his voice to a desperate hiss. He promised the remaining capital was secured. I heard him whisper that the Montana lease is a done deal and the developers are finalizing the paperwork by Friday. He swore the collateral was guaranteed. I carefully refolded the legal agreement and slipped it back into the jacket pocket, leaving it exactly as I found it. I stepped away from the chair and picked up a roll of clear packing tape just as Tyler terminated the call. He turned around, forcing a stiff, rigid smile. He claimed the interruption was just a lingering vendor dispute and stated he needed to hit the road to handle some tedious paperwork. He grabbed his jacket, wished me luck on my job hunt, and rushed out the door without looking back. I locked the deadbolt behind him. I sat down at the kitchen island and opened the photo gallery on my screen. I zoomed in on the captured document. The numerical figures printed on the page were staggering. Tyler did not owe a few disgruntled software investors a minor deficit. He owed $2.5 million to a predatory corporate lending syndicate. The stolen inheritance money was just the minimum penalty payment required to keep the firm from seizing his immediate personal assets. The most crucial detail was printed clearly on the second page. Tyler had secured the remaining $2 million deficit using a preliminary collateral guarantee. The physical asset listed on that guarantee was the Crawford family ranch. My stepbrother was leveraging thousands of acres of pristine wilderness to cover a fraudulent personal debt. My father and Brenda were not merely stealing my cash to bail him out. They were orchestrating a hurried land lease with commercial developers to generate capital before the Chicago lenders foreclosed on the entire estate. They thought I was out of the game. They assumed the unemployed daughter would stay in the city and silently update her resume. They relied on my perceived weakness. I grabbed my car keys and slung my canvas duffel bag over my shoulder. The drive to the rural property would take 10 hours. I needed every single minute of that journey to build a strategic trap they would never see coming. The battlefield had shifted from a stolen bank account to the very soil my grandfather owned. I was going back to Big Sky Country to read the fine print. The asphalt stretched forward, endless and gray, cutting through the imposing silhouettes of the Bitterroot Mountains. I drove through the night, letting the dropping temperature cool my thoughts. This was Big Sky Country. The air carried the sharp scent of pine needles and cold river water. The landscape did not care about designer watches or leveraged software companies. The earth here was unyielding. It demanded respect and punished arrogance. My grandfather understood that rhythm. He carved a cattle operation out of stubborn soil and freezing winters. He left behind a legacy measured in acreage and timber. Now my father and stepmother were trying to package that blood equity into a sanitized brochure. Before I reached the property lines, I made a strategic detour. A successful tactical offensive always requires a compelling distraction. I pulled my vehicle into a fading strip mall 3 towns over from the ranch. The storefronts featured a discount pharmacy, a struggling dry cleaner, and a legal practice boasting neon window signage. I walked into the cramped office and hired the least competent attorney available. He wore a rumpled suit and smelled faintly of stale cigarettes. I handed him a small retainer fee in cash and dictated a formal demand letter directed at my father. I instructed the lawyer to draft the correspondence using the most pathetic emotional language possible. I told him to whine about fairness and demand the immediate return of the stolen liquid inheritance. The document portrayed me as a desperate, grieving daughter, clinging to the loss of a bank account. It was a calculated decoy. By focusing their attention entirely on the missing cash, Richard and Brenda would remain blind to the true target. They would spend their energy laughing at my futile attempt to recover the money, while I dismantled the ground beneath their feet. I left the legal clinic and completed the drive to the family homestead. The gravel driveway crunched beneath my tires. The historic main house stood against the tree line, a sprawling structure built from native river stone and heavy timber logs. But the exterior was already changing. Temporary fencing corralled the front yard. A polished wooden sign near the porch advertised a future, luxury wilderness retreat. They were not merely leasing the grazing pastures. They were transforming a century-old working ranch into an exclusive playground for wealthy tourists. I parked out of sight near the old tractor barn and walked toward the side entrance. The heavy oak door swung open, revealing a staged nightmare. Brenda had invaded the interior. The rich smell of worn leather and wood smoke was gone, replaced by the sterile odor of industrial cleaning supplies and synthetic vanilla candles. She had ordered workers to strip the antique rugs and paint the dark wood paneling a bright, clinical white. I stepped quietly into the main hallway. The walls were decorated with trendy, mass-produced canvas art depicting abstract geometric shapes. Brenda intended to create an aesthetic of rustic chic for the incoming private equity executives, but the structure itself rejected the superficial redesign. As I walked past the dining room, a loud clatter echoed through the corridor. One of the cheap metal frames plummeted to the hardwood floor, shattering the glass. The thin, modern nails Brenda used could not grip the dense 100-year-old plaster. The foundation was too hard, too resilient for her flimsy improvements. Her plans lacked a structural anchor. I continued into the living area. My grandfather used to sit by the stone fireplace reading agricultural journals and weather reports. His favorite piece of furniture was a heavy, worn armchair. The leather bore the permanent impressions of his resting hands. Brenda had shoved the heirloom into a dark, dusty corner near the utility closet, draped with a plastic drop cloth, to make room for a minimalist velvet sofa. The disrespect was deliberate. She was attempting to erase the architect of the estate so she could claim the throne. Through the front window, I saw my father's vehicle approach the house. I retreated into the shadows of the adjacent study, keeping my breathing steady. Richard and Brenda walked through the front door, laughing. My father held the certified envelope from the strip mall attorney. He tore open the paper seal and read the whiny demand letter aloud. Brenda let out a sharp, patronizing laugh. She mocked the amateur legal phrasing and dismissed the threat entirely. She told my father that I was throwing a childish temper tantrum over spilled milk. Richard folded the paper and tossed it onto the kitchen counter with a smug, dismissive gesture. The decoy worked perfectly. They believed they had outmaneuvered me. They thought my entire strategy relied on recovering the lost funds. Their arrogance created a fatal blind spot. They stopped looking over their shoulders. While they poured expensive wine to celebrate their perceived victory, I slipped silently down the narrow wooden staircase leading into the basement. The cellar was cool and smelled of damp earth and aging paper. This subterranean room held the true history of the property. Metal filing cabinets lined the far concrete wall, containing decades of operational records. My father considered this room a graveyard for obsolete paperwork. He never bothered to organize or secure the contents. He assumed the digital summaries provided by the estate accountants contained everything he needed to know. I pulled a small flashlight from my pocket and illuminated the metallic drawers. I bypassed the recent tax filings and the agricultural receipts. I searched for the foundational documents, the folders containing the original geological surveys and the county parcel maps. I pulled a thick stack of manila folders from the bottom drawer and spread them across a dusty wooden work table. The paperwork was dense, filled with archaic surveying terminology and complex topographical charts. I activated my contract analyst protocol. I cross-referenced the boundary lines drawn on the county maps with the geographical coordinates listed in the private equity loan document I photographed from Tyler's jacket. The puzzle pieces began to interlock, forming a devastating picture. The developers were not just leasing the surface grass to build a luxury clubhouse. The specific acreage they demanded for the resort sat directly over the primary aquifer. The coordinates aligned perfectly with the deepest, most valuable subterranean water source in the valley. Tyler had promised the Chicago lenders access to natural resources that sustained the entire region. The developers intended to drain the aquifer to supply their artificial lakes and high-end amenities, leaving the surrounding land barren. My eyes scanned the edges of the oldest survey map. There was a faint handwritten notation in the margin, penned in my grandfather's distinctive block lettering. The ink directed the reader to a secondary county filing index. The numbers did not correlate with the main house or the surface pastures. They pointed to a separate, hidden trust structure. Before I could copy the index digits, a heavy footstep sounded on the floorboards directly above my head. The basement door creaked open, spilling a narrow beam of yellow light down the wooden stairs. I froze, turning off the flashlight. My father's voice echoed into the dark, damp space, calling my name. He did not sound smug anymore. He sounded panicked. Brenda had just returned from a trip into the local town, and she had not been silent about my arrival. The whisper campaign had already started, and the social isolation was about to trap me inside the very house I was trying to save. The morning sun offered no warmth as I navigated my vehicle down the winding mountain road toward the local township. My father had spent the previous evening searching the cellar, but I managed to slip through the exterior storm bulkhead doors before his flashlight could expose my position. I spent the night parked on a remote logging trail, sleeping in the passenger seat with the engine off. I needed basic supplies and a quiet environment to cross-reference the cryptic index digits I memorized from my grandfather's hidden files. The county archives were located in the center of town. I also needed to understand the public narrative my family was constructing. I drove past the welcome sign, expecting to find comfort in the familiar brick buildings and weathered storefronts. This was the community my grandfather John helped build. He funded the volunteer fire department decades ago and paid for the high school stadium lights. I assumed that legacy carried weight. I was severely mistaken. I pulled my car into the singular gas station on the edge of the county line. My corporate severance package was painfully thin. I needed to conserve my dwindling financial resources and hide my transactions from any electronic banking trails my father might try to monitor. I stepped out into the frigid air and walked inside the convenience store to pay for my fuel. I pulled the few crisp paper bills from my wallet. The woman standing behind the register was Sarah. We sat next to each other in high school biology. We shared lunches and studied for exams together before I left for the city to pursue my career. I offered a polite greeting and placed the currency on the scratched laminate counter. Sarah did not smile. Her eyes hardened into a bitter, judgmental glare. She snatched the money without speaking a single word and slammed the cash register drawer shut. She handed me my change, dropping the coins onto the counter instead of placing them in my outstretched palm. She muttered a quiet, passive-aggressive remark about city folks returning home just to steal what did not belong to them. The venom in her voice was unmistakable. I did not argue with her. I gathered my coins and walked back to the pump. The interaction was not an isolated incident. It was the opening sequence of a coordinated attack. I left the station and drove toward the commercial center of the valley. I parked near the local hardware and agricultural supply store. The wooden floorboards creaked beneath my heavy boots as I walked through the front entrance. The air inside smelled of grain dust and machinery grease. 4 local ranchers stood near the checkout counter, drinking black coffee from paper cups. The moment I stepped into the main aisle, their casual conversation abruptly stopped. The silence in the room was dense and deliberate. They turned their backs to me, refusing to acknowledge my presence. I walked toward the back shelving units, pretending to inspect a row of leather work gloves. I listened closely to the hushed whispers drifting over the inventory racks. Brenda had executed a flawless preemptive social strike. I heard the men repeating the exact phrases my stepmother must have planted across the community over the past 48 hours. They called me a ruthless corporate elitist. They whispered that I abandoned my family for a fancy metropolitan job and only returned to hoard the beloved old man's wealth. The most vicious rumor claimed I was actively filing frivolous lawsuits to evict my own father from his rightful home. Brenda spun a masterful fiction. By painting me as a greedy, ungrateful villain, she successfully masked the family's actual theft. She also provided cover for the impending environmental destruction planned by the Chicago private equity firm. She isolated me from the only community that might have stood by my side and demanded accountability. The psychological warfare tested my endurance. Standing in that hardware store, surrounded by people who had known me since childhood, the natural human instinct was to fight back. A desperate daughter would have marched up to the counter and screamed the truth. She would have pulled out her cellular phone and displayed the photographs of Tyler's fraudulent $2 million loan agreement. She would have pleaded with the town to look at the evidence and recognize the real criminals selling their future to out-of-state developers. But engaging in local melodrama is a severe tactical error. Correcting gossip wastes valuable energy and surrenders the element of surprise. My career taught me that you do not win a war by arguing with foot soldiers who eagerly believe a comfortable lie. You win by destroying the generals who authored the deception. I maintained my composure. I kept my breathing steady and my facial expression completely blank. I grabbed a pair of generic work gloves and walked to the front register. The clerk processed my transaction in complete silence, refusing to meet my gaze. I took my printed receipt and turned toward the exit door. Next to the glass entryway, a large cork bulletin board displayed community announcements and local business cards. Amidst the faded paper advertisements, a glossy, heavy cardstock flyer caught my attention. The document featured high-resolution architectural renderings. The images perfectly matched the building blueprints Brenda had scattered across the staging table back at the ranch. The bold text promised a serene, luxury wilderness retreat coming soon to the valley. The promotional material highlighted pristine water features and exclusive recreational fishing access for elite members. My contract analyst instincts flared, assessing the danger. The developers were moving with terrifying speed. They were already seeding marketing materials into the local township before the master lease was even finalized. They promised the town increased tourism revenue and environmental conservation. It was a beautiful, glittering deception. The geographical coordinates I verified the night before proved their true intention. They planned to drain the primary subterranean aquifer to supply their artificial high-end amenities. They were going to bleed the surrounding agricultural land dry to water their private golf greens and fill their decorative fountains. And the town was eagerly cheering them on, believing the falsehoods printed on a shiny piece of cardboard. I stepped out of the hardware store into the biting Montana wind. The cold air stung my cheeks. The social isolation was total and absolute. I stood on the sidewalk of my hometown and realized I did not have a single ally left in the entire zip code. My family had stolen my financial stability. My stepmother had eradicated my personal reputation. The community I trusted viewed me as a wealthy, hostile invader intent on ruining their prosperous future. The emotional weight of the situation threatened to crush my resolve. I walked toward my parked car, relying entirely on my intellect to suppress my rising frustration. I reminded myself that the truth does not require a popular consensus to be legally binding. The town could whisper behind my back all they wanted. Their opinions could not change the structural integrity of a certified property deed. I was preparing to drop a legal nuclear weapon on my betrayers, and I needed to finalize the launch sequence without distraction. I just needed to decode the hidden index numbers from the basement to arm the payload. I reached for my vehicle door handle, ready to return to the shadows and finish my investigation. Suddenly, a voice cut through the freezing wind. Someone stepped out from the narrow brick alleyway beside the public library. I turned around, expecting another hostile local ready to hurl insults or demand my departure. Instead, I saw a familiar woman wearing a heavy wool coat, her expression warm but incredibly serious. She was the only person in the valley who knew my father was soft and my stepbrother was a fraud. She knew exactly what I was searching for, and she had brought the map to find it. The freezing gusts swept across the pavement, biting through my thin canvas jacket. I stood beside my parked vehicle, calculating my next maneuver. The local residents had turned hostile. The town swallowed the poison my stepmother poured into their ears. I was an outcast in the very valley my ancestors settled. The social isolation was designed to break my spirit and force a hasty retreat back to the city. My enemies wanted me paralyzed by public shame. From the narrow brick corridor adjacent to the municipal library, a quiet figure emerged. The woman wore a tailored charcoal wool coat that contrasted sharply with the faded denim uniforms of the local ranchers. Her posture projected unyielding authority. It was Aunt Maya. Maya was the widow of my father's younger sibling. She was a brilliant African-American woman who relocated to this harsh northern territory decades ago. While my father spent his youth seeking validation from shallow country club elites, Maya spent her early years learning the intricate operations of the regional cattle business alongside the family patriarch. John respected her intellect. He admired her resilience. They shared a mutual understanding that a true legacy was forged through labor, not inherited through entitlement. When her husband passed away prematurely, she remained in the region, managing her own successful equine therapy center. She possessed the exact type of grit my father lacked. Brenda always resented her presence, viewing Maya as a threat to her curated suburban aesthetic. I instinctively stepped forward, but the elegant widow raised a single-gloved hand, instructing me to maintain my distance. She scanned the main street. Her dark eyes tracked the movements of a postal worker across the intersection and a barista wiping down a cafe window. She understood the surveillance mechanics of a small municipality. If Brenda's loyalists witnessed us collaborating, the vicious whisper campaign would target her therapy business next. We needed to operate in the shadows. She closed the gap between us with swift, purposeful strides. Her expression held profound gravity, softened by a faint trace of maternal warmth. She did not offer a comforting embrace or exchange pleasantries. She operated with tactical precision, treating our encounter like a covert exchange in hostile territory. From the deep pocket of her tailored garment, she produced a thick, rectangular object. She pressed it firmly against my chest, forcing me to secure the item with both hands. The artifact was surprisingly heavy. I looked down and recognized an ancient record book bound in cracked mahogany leather. Tarnished brass corner plates protected the fragile pages from deteriorating. I had seen this exact journal sitting on my grandfather's oak desk during my childhood. John anticipated this betrayal, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the howling wind. He knew Richard was weak. He saw the rot spreading the moment Brenda brought that arrogant boy into the household. I gripped the weathered spine. The leather felt cold and rigid against my palms. "They are selling the lower pastures," I replied, keeping my volume low to avoid eavesdroppers. "Tyler owes millions to a private equity firm in Chicago. They forged my signature on a quitclaim deed to finalize a commercial lease and satisfy the creditors." Maya did not look surprised by the criminal revelation. A grim, knowing expression settled over her elegant features. She adjusted her collar against the dropping temperature. "Your father always evaluated wealth by looking at the surface," she murmured. "He views the grass and the timber as the primary assets. John operated on a much deeper level. He left a contingency plan for you." She tapped the cover of the ancient book with her index finger. "Read the water, Victoria," she instructed. He left the map in the numbers. "You are the only person in this family equipped to decode his blueprint." Before I could ask for further clarification, a loud diesel engine roared down the avenue. A commercial delivery truck rattled past us, breaking the quiet tension. Maya took a deliberate step backward, distancing herself from my location. "Trust your analytical training," she added, her tone firm and final. "Do not let them steal the foundation." She turned and walked briskly away, dissolving into the pedestrian traffic near the local pharmacy. I stood alone on the concrete, holding the physical manifestation of my grandfather's foresight. The brief interaction restored my focus. I was no longer fighting a solitary battle. I possessed silent allies who valued integrity over bloodlines. I retreated into the driver's seat of my car and locked the doors. The interior cabin offered a temporary sanctuary from the hostile stares of passing citizens. I rested the heavy journal on the steering wheel. The brass hinges creaked in protest as I opened the front cover. The parchment was yellowed and brittle, smelling of dried ink and old cedar shavings. My grandfather possessed a highly methodical mind. The initial sections contained standard agricultural records. He documented seasonal rainfall totals, cattle auction prices, and monthly feed expenditures. The penmanship was utilitarian and precise. I turned the fragile sheets carefully, scanning the historical data. The records appeared entirely mundane. A casual observer would dismiss the bound volume as a relic of outdated farming administration. But my corporate profession trained me to identify anomalies hidden within dense volumes of text. I flipped past the agricultural summaries and reached the final quarter of the binding. The structural format abruptly changed. The handwritten paragraphs vanished. Instead, the pages displayed long vertical columns of alphanumeric sequences. The digits did not correspond to financial accounting or livestock inventory. They were formatted using a specific statutory syntax. I traced my finger down the first column. The sequence began with a county jurisdiction code, followed by a chronological date stamp, and ended with a unique subterranean parcel identifier. These were not arbitrary figures. They were legal filing coordinates. Maya's cryptic instruction echoed in my mind. Read the water. In the Western Territories, water was the ultimate currency. A man could own 10,000 acres of fertile soil, but if he did not control the mineral and liquid rights beneath the crust, his empire was highly vulnerable. The doctrine of prior appropriation governed this arid landscape. The coordinates listed in the ancient ledger pointed to specific filings within the regional property archives. My grandfather had executed a complex series of legal maneuvers concerning the subterranean aquifers long before his passing. He knew my father would eventually try to liquidate the visible assets for quick cash. John Crawford anticipated the short-sighted greed and installed a structural failsafe. He buried the true value of the estate deep underground and encoded the access keys within these numerical strings. I pulled a blank notepad from my glove compartment and began transcribing the most recent filing coordinates. My analytical instincts synchronized with the elder patriarch's strategic vision. The private equity developers planned to drain the regional water supply to sustain their artificial wilderness resort. They required unencumbered access to the aquifer to finalize their lavish project. If the numerical sequences in this journal proved what I suspected the developers were negotiating, a multi-million-dollar lease with a man who possessed zero legal authority over the necessary resources. The puzzle pieces were aligning, but the ledger alone was insufficient. A handwritten journal could not stop a commercial transaction. I needed the official, certified documents these numbers referenced. I needed the legally binding trust certificates stored in the secure county databases to prove the severance of the estate. This requirement presented an immediate and dangerous obstacle. The regional archive system was not accessible via a standard public internet connection. The high-security property records were protected behind a localized, encrypted portal. To view the official subterranean deeds, I needed proper authorization credentials. I needed a licensed legal representative who maintained access to the municipal servers. I could not utilize the incompetent strip mall attorney I hired earlier. That man was a designed distraction. He lacked the security clearance and the intellect to navigate a sophisticated corporate trust structure. I needed a formidable ally. I required a practitioner who understood the ruthless nature of Western property law and who respected my grandfather's legacy more than my father's checkbook. I started the vehicle engine. The heater blasted warm air across the dashboard, but my internal focus remained cold and calculated. The town considered me an enemy. My family viewed me as a defeated nuisance. They were all incorrect. I was a contract analyst armed with the exact coordinates to detonate their fraudulent enterprise. I shifted the transmission into drive and pulled away from the curb. The next phase of the operation required venturing deeper into the local legal establishment. I needed to find Elias Thorne. He was the original architect of John Crawford's estate plan. Elias was a notoriously difficult man who despised modern corporate interference. Earning his cooperation would be a severe test of my professional competence. If he refused to grant me access to the secure portal, the filing numbers in the brass ledger would remain useless, and Tyler's fraudulent lease would proceed unopposed. I parked my vehicle behind a dilapidated roadside diner on the extreme edge of the county limit. The establishment was dark, with the neon signage buzzing, emitting a faint electrical hum. I chose this location to steal an unsecured wireless signal emanating from the kitchen router. The interior of my car cabin was freezing, but I refused to start the engine. The vibration would break my concentration. I needed pure, unadulterated silence. I flipped open my laptop lid. The harsh blue glow of the liquid crystal display illuminated my face, casting sharp shadows against the frosted glass of the windows. The brass-bound ledger Aunt Maya provided sat across my steering wheel, open to the final pages. To decode the alphanumeric sequences listed in the aged journal, I required direct backdoor entry into the regional property archives. Standard public internet portals only displayed surface-level tax assessments. During my tenure at the corporate firm, I utilized a specialized municipal credential to verify complex interstate land deeds. The Human Resources Department terminated my employment that very morning. But corporate bureaucracy is notoriously slow. The information technology sector rarely revoked database access credentials within the first 72 hours of a layoff. I counted heavily on that administrative lag. I typed my complex login string into the Municipal Secure portal. The loading icon spun on the screen for 3 agonizing seconds. The suspense tightened my chest until the digital gateway finally granted me entry into the restricted county server. I bypassed the public records directory and navigated straight into the encrypted commercial encumbrance files. I cross-referenced the first numerical sequence from my grandfather's handwritten log. The search engine produced a dozen preliminary hits. I narrowed the search parameters, filtering the results against my stepbrother's legal name and recent transaction dates. A single digitized document materialized on my monitor. It was a primary lien registration filed by a predatory lending syndicate headquartered in Chicago. I opened the attached file and activated my standard review protocols. When you analyze contracts for a living, you learn to ignore the bold headings and hunt for the microscopic text buried in the addendums. The true nature of a financial agreement always hides in the margins. The bold print sells a dream, while the fine print secures a nightmare. Tyler did not owe a few frustrated tech investors a manageable sum. The principal amount listed on the bridge loan agreement was $2.5 million. The interest rate was exorbitant, structured to compound on a daily basis. The lending firm listed on the header specialized in high-risk corporate debt. They preyed on desperate novices who lacked the liquidity to sustain their fabricated lifestyles. Tyler had walked into a financial slaughterhouse, thinking he could outsmart men who dismantled legitimate companies for sport. I traced the chronological timeline of the recent transactions. The dates printed on the ledger interface revealed a terrifying reality. The $500,000 inheritance my father stole from my designated trust account did not even dent my stepbrother's principal balance. The contract specified severe default clauses, including punitive rate hikes. The stolen cash was instantly swallowed by late fees, penalty assessments, and short-term extension charges. My father handed over my entire financial future just to buy Tyler a brief 48-hour window of grace. The ticking clock was deafening. The Chicago firm granted a temporary stay of execution contingent upon a singular condition. Tyler had to provide tangible, high-value collateral to secure the remaining debt balance. If he failed to satisfy their terms, the syndicate would initiate immediate, hostile collection procedures. I scrolled down to the third page of the digital scan. The bold heading identified a preliminary pledge agreement. My eyes locked onto the geographical coordinates listed under the physical asset description. Tyler did not pledge an urban condominium or a fleet of luxury vehicles. He pledged the lower pastures of the Crawford family ranch. He used thousands of acres of pristine Montana wilderness to underwrite a failed software venture. The audacity of his maneuver was staggering. Tyler did not own a single blade of grass on that property. He possessed no legal claim to the estate. He was a beneficiary of my father's misplaced generosity, nothing more. Yet he offered the fertile soil, the ancient timber stands, and the vital grazing fields to a syndicate of cutthroat financiers. I scrutinized the signature blocks at the bottom of the page. My stepbrother's name was etched in a messy, rushed scrawl. He signed the document indicating he was a primary stakeholder with the authority to encumber the land. But corporate lenders require administrative verification to accept such vast collateral. They needed the signature of the acting estate executor to legitimize the pledge. Right next to Tyler's frantic handwriting was a countersignature. it belonged to Richard. My father had endorsed the preliminary pledge. He utilized his temporary authority as the estate administrator to validate a fraudulent transaction. He knowingly allowed Tyler to leverage land that belonged to a multi-generational trust. The implications of that ink stroke were catastrophic. I zoomed in on Richard's signature, analyzing the pen pressure and the letter formations. The lines were tight and uneven, betraying intense anxiety. He knew exactly what he was signing. He understood the profound risk, but his pathological need to protect his golden child overrode any remaining sense of moral duty. Richard and Brenda were not merely greedy parents favoring a spoiled son. They were active accomplices in a federal crime. By transmitting this forged collateral agreement across state lines to the Chicago headquarters, they committed wire fraud. The penalty for that offense was not a simple civil fine or a stern judicial warning. It involved mandatory federal prison sentences. They crossed a threshold from selfish negligence into felony conspiracy. The puzzle pieces of their desperate strategy finally aligned in my mind, forming a crystal clear picture. They were rushing to sign a master lease with the private equity wilderness developers because they needed an immediate, substantial capital injection. They intended to use the advance payment from the resort project to satisfy the Chicago syndicate and quietly erase Tyler's bridge loan before the lenders initiated foreclosure protocols. They were attempting to sell the soul of the valley to cover a criminal mistake. If the commercial lease closing did not happen by Friday afternoon, Tyler would officially default. The predatory lenders would activate their seizure clauses and claim the entire legacy my grandfather spent a lifetime building. My father was holding a lit match over a powder keg, hoping he could blow out the flame before the fuse vanished. I stared at the glowing pixels, feeling a cold, terrifying clarity settle over my thoughts. The power dynamic had shifted entirely. I no longer felt the sting of a stolen bank account. The liquid cash was a distraction, a minor casualty in a much larger war. I held the digital evidence required to annihilate them. I could forward the file to the state attorney general right now and watch the authorities descend upon the ranch by morning. But premature detonation is the mark of an amateur tactician. If I exposed the fraud tonight, Richard would claim ignorance or point the finger at a clerical error. Tyler would hire a defense attorney and tie the estate up in endless, expensive litigation. The private equity developers would back away from the scandal, leaving the property vulnerable to a prolonged bank seizure while the courts sorted out the mess. To execute a flawless victory, the trap had to snap shut at the point of maximum exposure. I needed to let them walk into the closing room. I needed to let them sit across the mahogany table from the developers and sign the final master lease. I had to wait for the exact moment they believed they had won and secured their salvation. Only then would I drop the deed of severance and watch their fraudulent empire collapse under the weight of their own arrogance. I saved the encrypted documents to a secure external hard drive and severed the internet connection. The screen went dark, plunging the vehicle back into the cold Montana night. The ambient temperature inside the car had dropped below freezing, but I did not feel the chill. The adrenaline pumping through my veins provided sufficient heat. I possessed the weapon. Now I required the armor. I needed certified physical copies of the original trust to present at the closing table. Digital scans would not suffice in a formal legal setting. I required documents carrying the official raised seal of the county clerk. That meant I could no longer delay my meeting with the estate architect. I turned the ignition key, bringing the heavy engine to life. The headlights pierced the darkness, illuminating the frost-covered asphalt ahead. It was time to introduce myself to Elias Thorne. The old lawyer respected grit and preparation above all else. I intended to walk into his office and prove that John Crawford's granddaughter was ready to claim her inheritance. The dawn broke over the Bitterroot Mountains, painting the frost-covered pines in pale shades of gold and bruised purple. I drove back into the municipal center just as the local businesses began unlocking their front doors. My destination was a narrow brick building situated at the end of Main Street. The exterior lacked neon signage or modern marketing displays. A simple brass plaque bolted beside the heavy oak door read, "Elias Thorne, Attorney at Law." The tarnished metal signaled a practice built on enduring generational relationships rather than flashy client acquisition. Elias was the original architect of my grandfather's estate plan. He was a relic of the old Western legal establishment. He spent his career navigating complex water rights disputes and hostile land acquisitions for cattle barons who sealed multi-million-dollar deals with a firm handshake. He despised modern corporate interference and held zero tolerance for superficial heirs. My father always avoided this office, preferring the compliant, expensive lawyers in the city who billed by the hour to tell him what he wanted to hear. I pushed the oak door open and stepped into a reception area that smelled distinctly of aged paper and sweet pipe tobacco. The walls were lined with dark mahogany bookshelves sagging under the weight of leather-bound statutory volumes. An older woman, sitting behind a heavy wooden desk, looked up from her typewriter. I did not offer a polite greeting. I requested an immediate audience with the senior partner. She noted my firm tone, picked up a desktop telephone, and murmured a few syllables into the receiver. A moment later, she nodded toward the frosted glass door at the end of the corridor. I turned the brass knob and entered his private sanctuary. Elias sat behind a massive slab of polished walnut. He wore a tweed suit that had likely been tailored 2 decades ago. His face was weathered, etched with deep lines from years spent inspecting fence boundaries under the harsh sun. On his right hand, he wore a heavy silver ring set with a striking piece of raw turquoise. He tapped the gemstone rhythmic and steady against the wooden desk surface. The sound filled the quiet room, functioning like a metronome, pacing his evaluation of my arrival. He did not stand to greet me. He gestured toward a leather guest chair with a subtle tilt of his chin. His piercing gray eyes studied my face, searching for signs of sleep deprivation or emotional fragility. He assumed he knew exactly why I was standing in his office. "You look like your grandfather," he noted, his voice possessing a rough gravel texture. But looking like John Crawford and operating like him are 2 different things. I received a copy of that pathetic demand letter your strip mall attorney drafted yesterday. It was a poorly constructed document, Victoria. Your father executed a standard fiduciary reallocation regarding the liquid accounts. The surface estate paperwork is ironclad. If you came here to weep over a stolen bank account and beg me to sue your stepmother, you are wasting my morning. The tapping of the turquoise ring continued. He was testing my composure, waiting for a predictable emotional outburst. A standard heir would have launched into a defensive tirade detailing the unfairness of the situation. I remained seated, keeping my posture rigid and my expression entirely blank. "I did not come here to weep over $50,000 bills," I replied, maintaining a calm, even cadence. The demand letter was a strategic diversion. It kept my father focused on a minor casualty while I audited the actual war zone. "The cash is gone, Elias. I accept that loss. I am here to discuss the criminal encumbrance of the lower acreage." The rhythm of the gemstone against the walnut ceased abruptly. The sudden silence in the room signaled a shift in the power dynamic. Elias narrowed his eyes, leaning forward slightly. He recognized the specific terminology I deployed. I unzipped my canvas duffel bag and withdrew the ancient brass-bound ledger Aunt Maya had delivered. I placed it gently on the center of his desk. Beside the weathered journal, I set my laptop, opening the screen to display the digital files I extracted from the municipal server during the night. I turned the monitor so he could view the illuminated text. "My stepbrother Tyler owes a high-risk private equity firm in Chicago $2.5 million. I stated, outlining the facts with clinical precision. The liquid cash my father authorized only covered the delinquent penalty fees. To secure the remaining deficit, Tyler signed a preliminary pledge agreement offering the primary grazing pastures and the subterranean aquifer access as collateral. Because Tyler holds no legal claim to the property, Richard forged a counter-signature on the digital contract to legitimize the pledge. They committed federal wire fraud to buy themselves a 48-hour window of grace. Elias stared at the glowing pixels on the screen. He read the dense legal phrasing, the interest schedules, and the geographical coordinates listed on the collateral addendum. His weathered face hardened into a mask of pure professional fury. He realized my family was not merely squandering their inheritance. They were actively jeopardizing the sovereign integrity of the valley. They are rushing to sign a master commercial lease with the wilderness resort developers. I continued, driving the final nail into the argument. They intend to use the incoming advance payment to erase the Chicago debt before the lending syndicate initiates foreclosure and seizes the land. Elias slowly closed the laptop screen. He looked up, meeting my gaze with profound respect. The gruff, dismissive attorney who greeted me 5 minutes ago vanished. In his place sat a formidable legal predator who realized he finally had a competent partner. He saw the cold, analytical ruthlessness of John Crawford sitting across his desk. "You found the index numbers in the ledger," he murmured, his tone shifting from adversarial to conspiratorial. "You decoded the failsafe." He stood up from his leather chair and walked toward the far corner of the office. A heavy iron filing cabinet stood bolted to the floorboards. He retrieved a small brass key from his waistcoat pocket and unlocked the reinforced steel drawer. The metallic click echoed through the quiet room. He extracted a thick manila envelope sealed with a red wax emblem. He returned to the desk and broke the seal, sliding the pristine, certified documents across the walnut surface. "Your grandfather anticipated Richard would eventually bankrupt the surface estate," Elias explained, tapping a specific paragraph on the top page. John utilized a legal mechanism known as a deed of severance. He divided the property rights into separate, distinct entities. He bequeathed the physical house, the driveway, and the superficial grass to your father. But he placed the raw earth, the timber yields, and every single drop of subterranean water into a blind, irrevocable trust. I picked up the heavy parchment, analyzing the raised notary seal, verifying its authenticity. The primary beneficiary and sole trustee of that subsurface holding was scheduled to inherit full executive control upon her 28th birthday. Elias continued, a grim smile touching the corners of his mouth. "A milestone you passed 2 weeks ago. Your father is attempting to lease a kingdom he does not own to developers who have no idea they are negotiating with a fraudster. We require perfect timing," I noted, calculating the closing window. "If we present this deed prematurely, they will simply cancel the lease and Tyler will flee the jurisdiction. We must let them sign the final commercial contracts. We must allow the developers to transfer the funds. Once the ink dries, the trap becomes permanent." Elias nodded in agreement. The developers accelerated their timeline, he revealed, delivering a critical piece of intelligence. They are nervous about the Chicago syndicate hovering over the title. Richard and Brenda scheduled the final lease execution for tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock. The meeting will take place in the formal dining room of the main house. They intend to project dominance by closing the deal on their home turf. 48 hours had suddenly collapsed into barely 30. The definitive ticking clock was set. The margins for error vanished. "I require formal corporate representation at that table," I stated, shifting the parameters of our alliance. "I cannot walk into that room as a discarded daughter. I must enter as the acting executive trustee. I need you to stand beside me, Elias, not as my grandfather's old friend, but as my retained legal counsel." The seasoned lawyer extended his right hand across the polished wood. I met his grip. His handshake was firm, sealing our tactical pact. The tension in my shoulders finally dissolved. I was no longer merely surviving a familial betrayal. I was officially arming myself for a systematic execution. I possessed the certified documents, the strategic timeline, and the most ruthless attorney in the territory. Before I gathered my materials to leave, Elias raised a finger, issuing a stark warning. "Do not underestimate the enemy operating on the field," he cautioned, his tone turning grave. The Chicago private equity firm dispatched their lead corporate counsel to secure the collateral. He arrived in the valley yesterday morning. He is currently surveying the property lines, ensuring the physical assets match the forged pledge agreement. He is a dangerous man, Victoria. He earns his living by bullying local landowners and burying them in frivolous litigation. I zipped my duffel bag, securing the certified trust deeds inside the hidden compartment. I thanked Elias for his guidance and stepped out of the tobacco-scented office into the bright, freezing morning. The final phase of the operation required confronting the out-of-state corporate bully on my own soil. I welcomed the challenge. The Chicago lawyer thought he was traveling to rural Montana to intimidate an unsophisticated family. He was about to discover that the most dangerous predator in the valley was a recently unemployed contract analyst with nothing left to lose. The drive from the legal office of Elias Thorne took less than 40 minutes, but the landscape transformed dramatically as I approached the boundaries of the Crawford family ranch. I steered my vehicle away from the main gravel driveway, taking a secondary dirt road that bordered the lower pastures. This was the specific acreage Tyler had pledged to the lending syndicate. The ground here sloped gently toward the winding river, creating a natural amphitheater of tall grass and ancient cottonwood trees. The morning frost still clung to the frozen earth, glittering under the pale sunlight. A black luxury sport utility vehicle sat parked near the old wooden fence line. The rental car possessed immaculate paint, lacking the customary coating of highway dust that marked every local truck in the valley. A man stood 50 yards away holding a digital surveying tablet. He wore a tailored thermal jacket and a pair of imported hiking boots. The leather on his footwear was flawless, without a single scuff or smear of mud. He looked like a catalog model deposited into a rugged reality. He was out of his element, but attempting to project ownership over the terrain. I turned off my engine and stepped out into the crisp air. The crunch of my boots on the frozen gravel alerted him to my presence. He turned and marched toward me. His posture was rigid, projecting an artificial dominance taught in expensive negotiation seminars. He was the lead corporate counsel for the Chicago private equity firm. Elias had warned me about his arrival earlier that morning. He stopped a few feet away and demanded to know my identity. I introduced myself simply as Victoria. He offered a condescending smirk. He stated that my father, Richard, had warned him about a disgruntled daughter causing minor friction. He pronounced the name of our county incorrectly, emphasizing the wrong syllable. It was a glaring tell. He possessed zero understanding of the local geography or the cultural landscape. He viewed the land merely as a line item on a balance sheet. He launched into a rehearsed intimidation script. He warned me that his clients were finalizing a commercial lease to develop a luxury wilderness resort. He claimed any attempt to disrupt the proceedings would result in a lawsuit for tortious interference. He threw around heavy legal terminology, hoping to overwhelm a supposedly naive local resident. He threatened to utilize eminent domain loopholes, citing a vague municipal economic development clause. He promised to bury me in court fees until I surrendered my objections and vacated the premises permanently. The sound of the rushing river behind him drowned out his empty threats. The rhythmic churning of the cold water triggered a visceral memory. I was 10 years old, standing knee-deep in that exact same current. The water was freezing, sending sharp aches up my calves. My grandfather John stood beside me, wearing heavy rubber waders. He held a handful of wet river stones. He tossed the rocks into the current and pointed down at the swirling depths. He told me that people get distracted by the surface. He said fools fight over the dirt. Kings own what runs beneath it. He taught me that day that true power is invisible until it is unleashed. He wanted me to understand that the soil was just a blanket, covering the real treasure of the Western Territories. The water and the minerals dictated the future. The memory faded, returning my focus to the arrogant attorney standing in front of me. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or defend my familial rights. Instead, I offered a slow, clinical smile. In the corporate sector, aggressive posturing is rarely a display of actual strength. It is almost always a smokescreen for underlying vulnerability. A lawyer holding an ironclad contract does not need to corner a young woman in a frozen field to issue threats. I looked down at his pristine hiking boots and then back up to his eyes. I informed him that eminent domain statutes in this specific jurisdiction strictly prohibit seizures for private commercial enrichment under the updated agricultural protection codes. I cited the exact section and paragraph of the Montana property regulations. I kept my tone conversational but precise. I explained that his municipal economic development clause was repealed by the state legislature 3 years ago. I watched his expression shift as my words landed. I told him his threats were legally baseless. I pointed out that a senior partner from a major Chicago firm does not travel halfway across the country to intimidate a single family member unless the underlying title is inherently unstable. I diagnosed his panic out loud. He knew the collateral pledge provided by my stepbrother was incredibly fragile. The developers were rushing the closing timeline because they feared a competing claim. They needed the ink to dry before anyone looked too closely at the subterranean rights or investigated Tyler's actual ownership status. The color drained from his face. His arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of genuine alarm. He expected a weeping daughter or a screaming local. He did not expect a corporate contract sniper capable of dissecting his bluff in under 2 minutes. The dramatic irony hung thick in the cold air. He had no idea I held the certified trust deeds in my duffel bag, proving his entire project was a criminal fiction. He thought he was bullying a powerless girl. He was actually speaking to the sole executive trustee of the land beneath his feet. He struggled to regain his composure. He adjusted his jacket collar and issued one final generic warning about facing severe consequences if I interfered with the signing tomorrow. The polished delivery was gone. His voice carried a slight tremor of uncertainty. He turned around and walked back to his luxury rental car. His immaculate boots finally caught the edge of a muddy puddle staining the expensive leather. He climbed into the driver's seat and slammed the door. The engine roared to life, and he sped away down the dirt road, leaving a cloud of exhaust in his wake. I watched his vehicle disappear around the bend. The encounter confirmed everything Elias and I discussed. The enemy was terrified and moving recklessly. The developers were pushing my parents to finalize the paperwork because they sensed the instability of the deal. They were eager to secure the lease and transfer the liability. I turned my back to the river and began the long walk toward the historic main house. The property felt different now. I was no longer a guest or a victim. I was the guardian of the estate. I walked past the staging areas and the temporary fencing Brenda had erected. The cheap, modern improvements looked pathetic against the enduring strength of the natural landscape. As I crested the final hill, I saw Richard and Brenda waiting for me on the back porch. The Whisper campaign had failed to drive me away. The Chicago lawyer had failed to intimidate me. My parents realized their external pressure tactics were ineffective. They needed to handle the situation internally. Richard held a sheet of white paper in his hand. Tyler paced nervously behind them, biting his fingernails. They were preparing their final, desperate trap, attempting to force my signature and legitimize their crime before the closing table commenced. I walked through the heavy wooden back door and stepped into the ranch kitchen. The space used to serve as the beating heart of the property. During my childhood, the room smelled of roasted coffee beans, wet wool, and burning cedar. My grandfather would sit at the scarred oak table reviewing cattle manifests before dawn. Now the environment felt sterile and unrecognizable. Brenda had ordered a complete cosmetic overhaul. The rustic iron cabinet hardware was replaced with brushed nickel. The warm ambient lighting was swapped for harsh, recessed fixtures that cast an unflattering glare across the polished granite island. My father stood near the center of the room. Brenda sat on a high metal stool, holding a crumpled tissue. Tyler lingered near the hallway shadow, gnawing nervously on his thumbnail. They looked like a tribunal waiting to pass judgment. They had watched me walk back from the lower pastures after my encounter with the Chicago attorney. They realized their external pressure tactics had failed. The Town Whisper campaign did not drive me away. The out-of-state corporate bully did not frighten me into packing my bags. They recognized that the closing timeline was shrinking rapidly, and they needed to handle the obstacle internally. Richard motioned for me to approach the stone counter. He did not ask about my morning or inquire about my walk. He treated me like a hostile witness in a deposition. Brenda immediately initiated the performance. She dabbed her perfectly dry eyes with the tissue and began a rehearsed emotional monologue. She spoke about Tyler. She mentioned his supposedly fragile state of mind and the immense pressure he faced as a young entrepreneur. She recounted how difficult his 20s had been, navigating a harsh economic climate. She conveniently omitted his chronic laziness and the string of luxury vehicles my father financed to repair his bruised ego. She painted him as a tragic victim of circumstance who merely needed one final push to succeed. Brenda lowered her voice to a pathetic theatrical whisper, claiming that family must forgive past transgressions to secure a united future. She said I owed my stepbrother this second chance because I had always possessed natural intellectual advantages he lacked. It was a fascinating display of psychological manipulation. She was attempting to weaponize my own competence against me. She wanted me to feel guilty for surviving my corporate layoff, while Tyler drowned in his fabricated business debts. While Brenda provided the emotional distraction, Richard executed the mechanical maneuver. He slid a single sheet of paper across the polished granite surface. He placed a silver pen right beside it. I looked down at the document. It was printed on cheap, bright white copy paper. The stark color clashed violently with the heavy cream stationery my grandfather always preferred for official legal affairs. Richard cleared his throat. He told me the paper was a standard liability waiver. He claimed the private equity developers required the signature of all surviving descendants merely to expedite the commercial lease bureaucracy. He used a patronizing tone, explaining the process as if I were a confused child rather than a seasoned corporate analyst. I did not touch the pen. I kept my hands folded casually in front of my waist. I scanned the paragraphs printed on the cheap sheet. The header contained misleading boilerplate text designed to look like a generic release form. But the structural mechanics buried in the second paragraph revealed the true nature of the trap. The legal phrasing was unmistakable. The document stated the grantor remises, releases, and forever quitclaims unto the grantee all interest in the specified parcel. It was a quitclaim deed disguised as a minor administrative release. By signing the bottom line, I would legally relinquish any future claim to the ancestral estate, surrendering my bloodline rights directly into my father's custody. He was trying to sever my connection to the dirt for the price of a cheap pen stroke. He needed this piece of paper to present a unified front to the Chicago lenders and prove he possessed the unilateral authority to encumber the land. I maintained a stone-faced expression. I stared directly into Richard's eyes, refusing to validate Brenda's theatrical weeping. The silence stretched across the kitchen, becoming heavier with every passing second. Tyler shifted his weight in the hallway, his expensive leather boots creaking against the floorboards. My father realized his emotional manipulation was failing. He saw the cold, analytical evaluation in my gaze. His facade of paternal concern evaporated instantly. His jaw tightened and his knuckles turned white against the edge of the granite countertop. He was sweating, despite the cool temperature in the room. I recognized the physical symptoms of a man cornered by his own disastrous choices. The looming threat of the Chicago syndicate and the impending federal wire fraud charges were eating him alive. He needed my signature to finalize the commercial lease and erase the debt before the private equity firm seized his home. Richard snapped. His voice rose, echoing off the sterile walls and shattering the quiet morning. He pointed a shaking finger at my chest. He warned me that he was the sole acting executor of the estate, and he held the absolute power to dictate my presence on the property. He abandoned the polite request and shifted directly to intimidation. He implied that if I refused to cooperate, he would summon the county sheriff to the house. He threatened to have me forcibly evicted for trespassing on his land. He demanded I stop acting like a bitter, unemployed child and execute the document immediately. I calculated the trajectory of the conflict. If I confronted his fraud right now and refused to sign, he might panic and cancel the public closing. He might attempt a clandestine transaction with the developers behind closed doors to bypass my interference. I needed him to walk into that formal dining room tomorrow afternoon. I needed him to sit alongside the Chicago attorneys and the resort executives. I needed him bloated with false confidence, believing he had secured his salvation. To win the war, I had to lose the battle in the kitchen. I surrendered. I allowed the mask of the fierce corporate sniper to slip away, replacing it with the defeated posture of a broken daughter. I lowered my gaze to the floor. I let my shoulders slump forward, projecting exhaustion and defeat. I manufactured a slight tremor in my vocal cords. I whispered that I understood the gravity of the situation. I told them I did not want to cause any more fractures within the family or force an ugly confrontation with local law enforcement. I reached out and picked up the cheap white paper, folding it carefully in half. I stated I needed the night to process the reality of my eviction, but I promised to attend the closing meeting tomorrow afternoon. I assured them I would bring the signed document to the table and make things right for everyone. Brenda exhaled a loud, dramatic sigh of relief. Her fake tears vanished instantly, replaced by a satisfied smirk. Richard uncurled his fists, a smug, victorious smile spreading across his weathered face. He told me he knew I would eventually see reason and do what was best for the Crawford legacy. Tyler stepped out of the shadows, looking like a condemned man who had just received a miraculous pardon from the governor. They believed their psychological abuse had conquered my intellect. They thought their threats had broken my spirit and forced my compliance. I turned around and walked out of the kitchen, leaving them to celebrate their hollow triumph. I carried the disguised quitclaim deed outside, heading toward the parked truck, where I would spend the night analyzing their clumsy forgery. They had just handed me the final piece of evidence required to destroy them, and they were completely oblivious to the impending slaughter. The night air settling over the ranch brought a freezing quiet to my childhood bedroom. The walls of this space had watched me grow from a stubborn girl into a meticulous professional. I sat at my old wooden desk with the blinds drawn tight against the darkness. A single desk lamp cast a narrow circle of yellow light across the scattered paperwork. I held my grandfather's dented tin coffee mug, letting the heat of the bitter black liquid warm my palms. The rest of the house was asleep. Down the hall, my father and stepmother were resting comfortably, believing they had secured their salvation. They thought the cheap white waiver sitting on the kitchen counter represented my unconditional surrender. They assumed the morning would bring a smooth transaction with the Chicago developers. They were dreaming of erased debts and unearned wealth. I was wide awake, translating the true architecture of our family legacy. I arranged the certified files Elias Thorne had provided alongside the brass-bound ledger Aunt Maya delivered. The contrast between the two sets of records was striking. The attorney's documents were crisp and formal, stamped with the raised seal of the county clerk. The ledger was weathered and intimate, filled with the slanted utilitarian handwriting of a man who measured his life in changing seasons and soil health. My corporate training took over, scanning the paragraphs and aligning the numerical index codes. I traced my finger down the yellowed page of the journal. A single word caught my attention. The term subsurface was written near the bottom margin. The ink was pressed deep into the paper. The word was underlined 3 times. It was a deliberate signal pointing directly toward a specific addendum in the certified trust portfolio. I pulled the corresponding legal file from the stack and began reading the dense clauses. Contract analysts are trained to look for hidden traps within standard agreements. We hunt for the invisible mechanisms that dictate the real distribution of power. As I parsed the archaic phrasing, a profound realization washed over me. The brilliant scope of my grandfather's foresight unspooled across the page. He had engineered a masterpiece of legal defense. The $500,000 in liquid cash was never intended to be my primary inheritance. That account was a calculated diversion. It was a behavioral test designed for a son who could not resist an easy escape route. John Crawford knew his own child better than anyone else. He recognized my father's profound weakness and his pathological need to appease Brenda and her spoiled son. My grandfather understood that if he left a pile of accessible currency on the table, Richard would eventually find a way to justify taking it. The cash was a tripwire. I read the fiduciary restrictions attached to the primary checking accounts. The language was brilliant. The estate directed the executor to hold the funds in a designated holding account until my professional graduation. But the document also contained a specific penalty provision. The text established an audit trigger. If the acting administrator misappropriated the liquid assets to satisfy external liabilities, the trust protocol initiated an automatic defensive response. By draining my designated funds to pay the penalty fees on Tyler's fraudulent private equity loan, my father stepped directly onto the wire. The trap snapping shut triggered an acceleration clause buried in the foundational property deed. I cross-referenced the ledger notes with the county certificates, holding my breath as the final puzzle pieces locked together. My grandfather had legally severed the physical estate. In Western property law, ownership is not a singular concept. The dirt you walk on and the minerals beneath your boots can belong to entirely different entities. John executed a flawless horizontal division of the ranch. He bequeathed the surface assets to Richard. My father owned the historic house, the gravel driveway, and the top layer of grass where the cattle grazed. He possessed the exact visual representation of wealth he always craved. But John stripped the actual power from the surface deed. He placed the raw earth, the ancient timber rights, and the vital subterranean aquifers into a blind, irrevocable trust. The water flowing beneath the soil belonged exclusively to this protected entity. Without access to the aquifer, the surface land was essentially barren. The private equity developers required those deep water reserves to sustain their proposed luxury resort. They were drafting a commercial lease with a man who owned the scenery but controlled none of the resources required to run the operation. The final clause of the irrevocable trust detailed the succession of power. The text named a singular executive trustee authorized to manage the subsurface holdings. The position was held in a dormant state, designed to activate upon the designated heir's 28th birthday. My 28th birthday had passed exactly 2 weeks ago. Because my father breached his fiduciary duty by stealing the bait money, the audit trigger accelerated my full, incontestable control over the entire severed estate. The legal mechanism was airtight. There were no loopholes for a Chicago attorney to exploit. There were no emotional pleas that could reverse the certified county filings. I was the sole guardian of the water and the timber. I took another sip of the black coffee, savoring the bitter taste. The profound, poetic justice of the situation was staggering. Richard and Brenda believed they were selling a kingdom to save their golden child. They were actually attempting to lease a hollow shell. They had spent the entire week mocking my silence and treating me like a defeated nuisance. They had poisoned the local township against me and forged my signature on a quitclaim deed. All of their frantic efforts were rendered entirely obsolete by the documents resting on my desk. I set the tin mug down and turned to the portable laser printer I'd brought from my apartment. I connected the device to my laptop and initiated the print sequence. The machine whirred to life, pulling fresh white paper through the rollers. I watched the black ink form the sharp, undeniable lines of the certified trust deed. Each page represented a nail in the coffin of my stepbrother's fabricated empire. I gathered the warm sheets of paper and organized them with clinical precision. I aligned the edges perfectly, ensuring the presentation was flawless. I pulled a plain manila folder from my duffel bag and slid the documents inside. I placed the secondary verification forms at the very back, securing the administrative requirement. The folder was thin and unassuming. It did not look like a weapon capable of destroying a commercial transaction. But the most dangerous traps are always hidden in plain sight. I placed the manila folder on the edge of the mattress and turned off the desk lamp. The room plunged back into total darkness. The ambient noise of the wind howling outside the window pane provided a steady rhythm. I lay down on the bed, fully clothed, staring up at the invisible ceiling. My heart rate was slow and rhythmic. I felt no fear regarding the impending confrontation. The anxiety that had plagued me since the termination of my corporate position evaporated. Tomorrow afternoon, the formal dining room downstairs would transform into a battlefield. The developers would arrive with their expensive suits and their predatory lease agreements. The Chicago attorney would sit at the table, eager to secure the collateral for his ruthless syndicate. Tyler would sweat in the corner, hoping the ink dried fast enough to save him from federal wire fraud charges. My father and stepmother would present their forged waivers and project a facade of total control. They would invite the discarded daughter to the table, expecting me to bow my head and sign away my legacy. They would assume the quietest person in the room was the weakest. I closed my eyes and let the silence of the old ranch wash over me. The trap was armed. The paperwork was verified. I was merely waiting for the sun to rise so I could strike the match. The pale winter sun crept over the jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Range, casting long, dark shadows across the frozen pastures. Inside the historic main house, the atmosphere felt dense and suffocating. The day of the closing had officially arrived. Brenda had spent the entire morning orchestrating a visual performance within the grand dining room. She transformed the rustic gathering space into a sterile corporate boardroom. A sprawling mahogany table dominated the center of the floor, polished to a high mirror shine. At the center of the wood, Brenda placed a tiered silver tray, overflowing with imported French pastries and delicate fruit tarts. The extravagant catering was a desperate attempt to project sophisticated wealth to the incoming metropolitan executives. It was an entirely hollow gesture. The delicate baked goods sat untouched, a stark contrast to the rugged environment outside the window panes. In the far corner of the room, shoved near the stone hearth, sat my grandfather's heavy leather armchair. The worn material still held the physical impression of the man who built this empire. The seat remained empty, functioning as a silent witness to the impending betrayal. Richard had tried to move the heirloom into the cellar earlier that morning, but the sheer weight of the dense oak frame defeated him. It lingered in the shadows, serving as an enduring reminder of the legacy they were currently attempting to liquidate. Tyler paced the length of the adjacent hallway like a trapped animal. The golden child was practically vibrating with nervous kinetic energy. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that fit poorly over his rigid frame. Every 30 seconds, he lifted his left wrist to check the time on his $15,000 chronograph. His entire existence had been defined by a lack of consequence. Whenever he stumbled, my father was always there with an open checkbook to cushion the fall. But Tyler understood the unique severity of his current predicament. He knew the Chicago lending syndicate did not operate like a forgiving parent. If the ink did not dry on the commercial lease today, he faced immediate federal wire fraud indictments for forging the collateral pledge. The sweat pooling at his temples betrayed his rising panic. Shortly before 2 p.m, a caravan of sleek black sport utility vehicles crunched up the gravel driveway. The commercial developers had arrived. 4 men stepped out into the biting cold wearing sharp dark suits and expensive wool overcoats. Leading the delegation was the corporate attorney I encountered in the lower pastures the previous day. He had discarded his ruined hiking boots in favor of polished Italian leather loafers. The executives marched up the wooden porch steps, treating the environment with thinly veiled contempt. They viewed the sweeping Montana wilderness merely as an unexploited asset, and they viewed my family as naive rural obstacles waiting to be pushed aside. I walked down the wooden staircase carrying nothing but a single, unmarked manila folder. My attire was professional but subdued, consisting of a structured navy blazer and dark trousers. I did not project the image of a defeated victim or a hostile combatant. I projected the cold neutrality of a seasoned analyst arriving to audit a failing enterprise. When I entered the dining room, the ambush became immediately apparent. Richard and Brenda had arranged the seating to establish psychological dominance. My father sat at the head of the mahogany table, flanking himself with the imposing Chicago executives. They left a single isolated chair for me at the opposite end. They intended to surround me with authority figures and force my compliance through numeric intimidation. I took my designated seat, placing the thin folder flat on the polished wood. I crossed my ankles and rested my hands loosely in my lap. The room crackled with arrogant certainty. The developers unclasped their premium leather briefcases and began extracting thick stacks of legal contracts. The crisp white pages fanned out across the table, forming a physical barrier between the opposing sides. The lead attorney arranged his documents with practiced precision. He tapped a gold-plated fountain pen against the rim of his notepad. The rhythmic, metallic clicking echoed the ticking of Tyler's luxury watch, amplifying the underlying tension in the room. Richard leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. He attempted to channel the commanding presence of my late grandfather, but the posture appeared stiff and fraudulent. He looked down the length of the wood, fixing his gaze upon me. He did not bother introducing me to the corporate guests. He addressed me with a patronizing tone designed to diminish my standing in front of the developers. He stated, "The liability waiver we discussed in the kitchen the prior evening was prepared for my immediate endorsement. He told me to just sign the document and stop embarrassing the family with my stubborn behavior." He framed my hesitation as a childish grievance, disrupting a sophisticated business transaction. I did not respond. In high-stakes corporate negotiations, silence is a devastating weapon. Inexperienced negotiators talk constantly to fill the uncomfortable void, revealing their internal anxieties. Seasoned professionals allow the silence to stretch, letting the opposition drown in their own assumptions. I remained perfectly calm. I maintained steady eye contact with my father, allowing my lack of reaction to unsettle his manufactured confidence. The deliberate pacing of my breathing extended the suspense. I watched the overlapping conflicts funnel directly into this single, confined space. The crippling debt threatening my stepbrother, the short-sighted greed blinding my parents, and the predatory arrogance driving the Chicago executives all converged upon the documents resting on the table. The lead attorney grew impatient with the familial drama. He despised delays. He viewed my presence as a minor administrative hurdle delaying his client's profitable acquisition. He slid the forged quitclaim deed toward my side of the table. He positioned the gold pen parallel to the signature line. He offered a tight, condescending smile and instructed me to execute the release so the adults in the room could finalize the primary lease agreement. He spoke to me as if I were a confused assistant, failing to complete a routine filing task. Brenda shifted in her chair, offering a cloying maternal grimace. She whispered across the room, encouraging me to do the right thing for Tyler. She promised that once the paperwork was finalized, we could all move forward and heal the fracture. Her performance was sickeningly transparent. She was eager to finalize the theft of my legacy so she could return to her superficial lifestyle, unburdened by financial ruin. She looked at the untouched pastries and then back to my face, expecting immediate submission. I let them continue talking. I let my father issue another stern warning about respecting his authority as the estate executor. I let Tyler shift anxiously from foot to foot, muttering under his breath about investor deadlines. I let the developers glance at their phones, projecting sheer boredom with the rural theatrics. Every syllable they uttered dug their collective grave a few inches deeper. They were constructing a towering monument to their own hubris. The longer they spoke, the more securely they fastened the trap around their own necks. The Chicago lawyer tapped his pen one final time, demanding my compliance. He tapped the signature line with a manicured finger, signaling that his patience had expired. The air in the dining room grew stagnant and heavy. The antique grandfather clock in the hallway chimed, marking the passing hour. The snare was fully constructed, baited, and waiting. The moment had finally arrived to introduce the true architect of the estate to the gathered assembly. I slowly uncrossed my hands and reached toward the flat manila folder resting in front of me. The lead counsel representing the private equity firm exhaled a sharp breath of annoyance. He pushed the primary commercial contract across the polished mahogany surface. The thick stack of bonded paper slid until the signature line rested perfectly aligned with my chair. He tapped his gold fountain pen against the rim of his leather portfolio, signaling that his tolerance for rural family dynamics had officially expired. He viewed my hesitation as a pathetic stalling tactic, deployed by an emotional relative who failed to grasp the magnitude of modern commerce. Tyler could not maintain his composure any longer. The polished facade of a successful tech entrepreneur shattered completely. He leaned over the table, his face flushed a mottled crimson. He demanded I pick up the writing instrument and endorse the waiver. His voice cracked, pitching into a frantic whine. He blurted out that his investors were furious and the deadline was non-negotiable. He practically begged me to stop ruining his life. His outburst violated every rule of corporate negotiation, exposing his desperate vulnerability to the visiting executives. He showed the predators his exposed throat. I did not reach for the gold pen. I did not acknowledge my stepbrother's pathetic display. I kept my gaze fixed on the lead attorney. I slowly unclasped the flap of my plain manila folder. The movement was deliberate and unhurried, contrasting sharply with the frantic, kinetic energy suffocating the rest of the room. I extracted the certified documents I had printed the previous night. The thick pages bore the raised, embossed seal of the municipal clerk, validating their indisputable authenticity. I bypassed my father entirely. I slid the certified deed of severance directly toward the Chicago Council. The heavy parchment glided over the polished wood, coming to a halt right on top of his fraudulent master lease. I informed the room that a fundamental error plagued their transaction. My voice lacked any trace of anger or vindictiveness. It carried the biting chill of a deep Montana winter. I stated clinically that they had drafted a multi-million-dollar commercial agreement with individuals who possessed zero statutory authority to encumber the acreage. The lead attorney frowned. He picked up the certified document, expecting a primitive homemade contract or a frivolous legal objection from an uneducated local. His eyes scanned the bold heading printed at the top of the page. The phrase, "irrevocable subsurface trust," anchored the text. Below that, the declaration of severance detailed the exact horizontal division of the Crawford estate. I watched the precise second his brain processed the catastrophic reality. The color drained from his face, leaving his complexion an ashen gray. His jaw slackened. The arrogant smirk that had defined his features since our encounter in the lower pastures vanished completely. His fingers went numb. The expensive gold fountain pen slipped from his grip, clattering loudly against the hard wooden table. The metallic noise echoed through the silent dining room like a gunshot. I explained the mechanical structure of my grandfather's foresight. I detailed how John bequeathed the superficial assets to his only son. I clarified that Richard and Brenda held the official title to the physical house, the front porch, and the gravel driveway. I told the developers those cosmetic features represented the entirety of my parents' portfolio. They owned the structure, but they controlled nothing beyond the foundation. The Chicago attorney stared at the signature blocks, verifying my status as the sole executive trustee. The legal terminology was airtight, leaving no room for judicial interpretation or municipal loopholes. He realized his firm had spent weeks negotiating a massive infrastructure project with charlatans. He had staked his own professional reputation on vetting a deal that was entirely built on a forged premise. The liability he faced was astronomical. I reached across my designated space and picked up the dented tin coffee mug I had retrieved from my apartment. The metal was cold against my palm. This vessel was my grandfather's trusted companion during decades of brutal winters managing the cattle herds. It represented the authentic grit of the region. I raised the cup to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip of the chilled tap water. I swallowed, maintaining unbroken eye contact with the corporate delegation. "I own the water you are standing over," I stated. The declaration hung in the stagnant air, finalizing the execution. The private equity developers required access to the deep subterranean aquifers to sustain their proposed luxury wilderness resort. Without the liquid resources beneath the soil, the surrounding acres were commercially useless. They needed my signature on the master lease, but my parents had presented them with a forged quitclaim deed designed to bypass my authority entirely. Richard ruptured the quiet aftermath. He could not process the complexity of the certified trust or the magnitude of his defeat. His mind rejected the reality that his father had outsmarted him from beyond the grave. My father slammed both fists onto the mahogany surface, rattling the tiered tray of untouched French pastries. He vaulted out of his chair, his face contorted in blind rage. He shouted that he was the primary heir. He bellowed about his birthright, claiming he was the sole patriarch of the family. He pointed a trembling finger at me, accusing me of fabricating the municipal records. His voice echoed off the sterile white walls, sounding erratic and unhinged. He threw a temper tantrum in front of men who managed billions of dollars in international capital. He completely humiliated himself, stripping away whatever fragile dignity he had managed to retain. His performance merely confirmed his utter lack of sophistication. Brenda sat frozen on her stool. Her mouth opened and closed soundlessly, resembling a fish pulled onto dry land. She finally grasped that her curated suburban aesthetic was built on a legal illusion. The sprawling estate she planned to leverage for elite social status belonged to the stepdaughter she had spent the entire week attempting to destroy. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for a sympathetic face, but found only cold, calculating stares. The tension inside the room underwent a polarizing shift. The corporate developers stopped looking at me. Their collective gaze pivoted toward Richard and Tyler. The animosity they previously directed at the stubborn local girl instantly transferred to the men who had lured them into a criminal conspiracy. I was no longer the obstacle to their profit. I was the sovereign owner of the territory. My family members were the fraudsters who had wasted their time and jeopardized their funds. The Chicago attorney slowly recovered from his initial shock. He did not address my father's pathetic shouting. He gathered his fanned contracts and shoved them back into his premium leather briefcase. The realization of the fraud solidified in his mind. He recognized that Tyler had utilized assets he did not own to secure the preliminary bridge loan. He understood that Richard had provided a fraudulent countersignature to legitimize that collateral pledge. The visiting executives were no longer concerned with acquiring a scenic location for a future resort. They were now dealing with a textbook case of federal wire fraud perpetrated against their lending syndicate. They had wired funds across state lines based on forged collateral documents. The commercial acquisition had officially transformed into a hostile criminal recovery operation. The men at the table operated in a world where financial betrayal was punished with ruthless efficiency. Tyler backed away from the table, retreating toward the hallway. He bumped into the antique grandfather clock, sending a discordant chime through the corridor. He recognized the shift in the developer's posture. The men in the tailored suits were no longer his prospective business partners. They were his executioners. The syndicate did not forgive stolen capital, and they certainly did not tolerate public humiliation. I remained seated, sipping quietly from the old tin mug. The trap had snapped shut with flawless precision. I had not raised my voice or issued a single threat. I merely placed the certified truth on the polished wood and allowed the architects of the deception to consume each other. The conflict was no longer mine to fight. I had successfully redirected the predatory force of the Chicago syndicate directly onto the individuals who stole my inheritance. The impending destruction of my stepbrother's fabricated empire was now entirely out of my hands. The echoing sound of the dropped fountain pen marked the end of the negotiation. I leaned back in my chair and addressed the corporate delegation with deliberate clarity. I explained the exact mechanical nature of the deception they had just uncovered. I detailed how my grandfather structured the irrevocable trust to protect the essential resources of the valley. The documents resting on the mahogany wood proved that the subterranean water and the mineral rights belonged exclusively to the protected entity I now controlled. I shifted my focus to the specific collateral pledge my stepbrother executed to secure his initial bridge loan. I outlined the timeline, piece by piece, so the visiting executives understood the depth of the betrayal. Tyler offered the lower pastures as security for a multi-million-dollar debt. He transmitted those documents across state lines using digital channels. My father provided the countersignature, knowing full well he lacked the jurisdiction to encumber the physical acreage. I defined their actions using the precise statutory terminology. They committed federal wire fraud. They attempted to leverage a sovereign estate to erase a personal deficit. The lead Chicago attorney did not require a second explanation. His mind possessed a ruthless efficiency honed by years of corporate combat. He recognized a dead deal. He snapped his premium leather briefcase shut. The metallic click of the brass locks sounded like a final judgment in the quiet room. He stood up from the table, smoothing the lapels of his tailored suit jacket. He did not look at me. His gaze locked onto Tyler and Richard. The disdain in his eyes was visceral. He informed my family that his private equity firm did not tolerate criminal negligence. He stated his clients would be initiating immediate hostile collection procedures. The syndicate would file liens against every personal asset my stepbrother possessed. They would seize his bank accounts, his luxury vehicle, and any future earnings he might attempt to generate. The lawyer added that his firm would also forward the forged collateral documents to the federal prosecutor overseeing financial crimes in their district. He promised a relentless pursuit until the entire debt was satisfied. The corporate delegation turned in unison and marched out of the dining room. Their expensive Italian leather shoes echoed down the hallway. The heavy front door opened and closed. A few moments later, the sound of their vehicles crunching down the gravel driveway faded into the distance. They abandoned the false partnership, leaving my relatives to face the wreckage of their own design. The antagonists had defeated themselves. I merely provided the illumination required to expose the rot. The immediate fallout within the room was devastating to witness. Richard lost all his manufactured bravado. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray. His knees buckled beneath him. He collapsed into the nearest dining chair, gripping the armrests with trembling fingers. His chest heaved as he struggled to draw oxygen into his lungs. The reality of his impending ruin crashed over him. He realized he had sacrificed his honor, his legacy, and his freedom to protect a boy who could not even protect himself. Brenda sat frozen nearby, her jaw dropped open, attempting to form words that refused to materialize. She closed her mouth and opened it again, resembling a suffocating fish. The curated suburban aesthetic she worshipped was built on an illusion that had just evaporated. She looked around the staged room at the untouched French pastries and the sterile white walls. The environment she designed to impress the corporate elites now felt like a pristine tomb. She had orchestrated the theft of my liquid inheritance and masterminded the Whisper campaign to destroy my reputation. Her meticulous plotting ultimately resulted in the destruction of her own comfortable life. In the far corner of the room, Tyler began to weep. The sound was pathetic and small. The golden child slid down the wall until he hit the floorboards. He pulled his knees to his chest and buried his face in his manicured hands. He lacked the emotional resilience to process the consequences of his actions. He had spent 30 years existing in a bubble of unearned privilege. The protective barrier had finally popped, exposing him to the harsh, unforgiving elements of the real world. Federal prison was no longer an abstract concept. It was a tangible, looming destination. The quiet weeping and the heavy breathing filled the stagnant air. I gathered my certified trust documents and placed them back into my plain manila folder. I secured the clasp, preparing to leave the table. Richard raised his head. His eyes were bloodshot and desperate. He looked at me not as a father viewing his daughter, but as a drowning man staring at a life raft. He reached his shaking hand across the polished mahogany surface. His voice cracked as he spoke. He begged me to intervene. He pleaded with me to use the vast resources of the irrevocable trust to bail Tyler out of the syndicate debt. He claimed I possessed the power to make the Chicago firm walk away. He promised he would apologize to the town and restore my public standing if I just saved the family from financial ruin. I stared at his outstretched hand. A week ago, I might have felt a brief flicker of sorrow for the man who raised me. Now I felt nothing but a cold corporate precision. I analyzed his request, evaluating the return on investment. Rescuing them offered zero tactical benefit. I declined his offer. My tone remained flat and analytical. I explained that fiduciary duty required me to protect the assets of the trust from unnecessary liabilities. Bailing out a fraudulent relative did not align with the statutory mandate established by my grandfather. I reminded Richard that he made a deliberate choice when he redirected my designated funds to cover Tyler's early penalty fees. He chose his loyalties, and now he had to endure the harvest. I stood up from the table, pushing my chair back. I looked at the 3 broken individuals occupying the space. The power dynamic was permanently inverted. I informed them that as the acting executive trustee, I was establishing immediate boundaries regarding the estate. I told Richard he could retain the physical structure of the historic house in the gravel driveway, just as the deed of severance stipulated. But the generosity ended at the foundation. I served them with formal, verbal notice. They were no longer permitted to trespass on the acreage surrounding the dwelling. They could not walk through the lower pastures. They could not access the riverbanks. They could not wander into the timber stands. If they stepped off the front porch onto the raw earth, they would be in violation of property laws. I promised to enforce the boundary with local law enforcement if they decided to test my resolve. They were effectively prisoners within their own home, surrounded by a sprawling wilderness they could see but never touch. I turned away from the mahogany table and walked toward the stone hearth. The heavy leather armchair rested in the shadows where Brenda had shoved it. The heirloom smelled of old tobacco and enduring strength. I pulled the plastic drop cloth off the cushions, letting the cheap synthetic material fall to the floorboards. I turned around and sat down. The worn leather creaked, adjusting to my weight. The dense oak frame offered solid, unyielding support. I rested my hands on the wide armrests. I looked across the room at the people who tried to erase my existence. They sat in terrified silence, watching me claim the throne. I was no longer the discarded, unemployed daughter. I was the guardian of Big Sky Country. I reclaimed the legacy my grandfather built. I sat in his chair for the very first time, and the fit was perfect. 6 months slipped through the Bitterroot Valley, carrying the freezing winter away and ushering in the bright thaw of late spring. The consequences of the closing table did not arrive in a single theatrical explosion. They manifested the way real justice often does. It was a slow, methodical dismantling of an illusion. The Chicago lending syndicate proved relentless. They activated their collection clauses within 48 hours of fleeing our dining room. Tyler was stripped of his artificial armor. The $90,000 custom truck disappeared from his apartment parking lot, towed away in the dead of night by an out-of-state repossession company. His banking privileges were revoked. The federal prosecutor formally indicted him on charges of wire fraud and interstate financial deception. He traded his designer bomber jackets for cheap, uninspired courtroom suits. He was forced to declare Chapter 7 bankruptcy, surrendering every material possession he had accumulated to delay his inevitable prison sentence. During his deposition, he attempted to utilize his usual charm, offering practiced smiles and empty excuses to the federal investigators. He learned the hard way that arrogance is a terrible shield against federal subpoenas. He sat in a sterile interrogation room, answering questions from ruthless auditors. His manicured hands shook as he signed his confession. The pristine image he cultivated his entire life shattered under the weight of sworn testimony. The government agents dissected his fabricated tech company, proving it was nothing more than a hollow shell designed to attract careless investors. He is currently awaiting sentencing, facing a mandatory minimum term in a low-security facility where his designer watches and boutique coffees will be replaced by standard-issue uniforms and rigid schedules. My father and stepmother faced a devastating ultimatum. The syndicate demanded immediate restitution for the forged collateral pledge. The authorities offered Tyler a reduced plea agreement only if the stolen capital was replenished. Richard and Brenda had 0 liquid assets remaining. The whisper campaign they initiated against me reversed its trajectory with brutal efficiency. The local township discovered the truth about the aborted commercial lease. The ranchers and business owners realized my family had attempted to sell the regional water supply to out-of-state developers. The community turned their backs. The clerks at the hardware store refused their patronage. The tellers at the bank offered nothing but cold stares. To save Tyler from federal prison, Richard and Brenda were forced to liquidate the only tangible property they legally held. They listed the historic surface house and the surrounding driveway for sale. Because a rural dwelling without access to the subterranean aquifer or timber rights holds limited commercial appeal, the property lingered on the market. They ultimately accepted a steep discount. The buyer was a local agricultural cooperative, requiring a centralized administrative headquarters. I watched from a distance the day the moving vans arrived. The movers carelessly handled her expensive furniture, scratching the minimalist velvet sofa she had placed over my grandfather's old footprints. Brenda supervised the loading of her trendy geometric canvas art and fragile glass centerpieces. Her face looked drawn and aged. The curated aesthetic she worshipped had crumbled, exposing the hollow foundation beneath. They relocated to a cramped two-bedroom condominium in a featureless subdivision outside a distant city. The neighborhood was defined by identical beige vinyl siding and tiny manicured lawns. It was a suffocating environment. They lost their social standing, the respect of the town, and the legacy they tried so desperately to steal. They were exiled from Big Sky country, confined to a sterile concrete environment that perfectly matched their hollow values. While my family retreated into suburban obscurity, I cemented the future of the estate. I spent the subsequent months sitting across the polished walnut desk from Elias Thorne. We drafted a network of unbreakable legal protections. We transferred the thousands of acres of timber stands, the rolling grazing pastures, and the deep subterranean aquifers into a permanent conservation easement. We ensured the pristine elk migration corridors remained untouched. We protected the spawning grounds for the native trout species residing in the river. The legal architecture we constructed ensured the land could never be subdivided, commercialized, or drained by private equity developers. The territory would remain wild and untamed, serving as a vital sanctuary for the regional ecosystem. Reviewing those final documents provided a profound sense of fulfillment my previous corporate career never offered. I was no longer analyzing contracts to enrich anonymous shareholders or protect greedy executives. I was reading the fine print to defend the earth itself. Elias filed the final paperwork at the county clerk office, sealing the fate of the valley. He handed me the stamped certified copies with a firm handshake. He told me John Crawford would be proud of the predator I had become. Because the original house belonged to the agricultural cooperative, I required a residence on the territory I retained. I hired a local crew to construct a modest cabin near the eastern bend of the river. The structure utilized reclaimed timber and local river stone. It lacked sprawling square footage or extravagant fixtures. Inside the cabin, the air smelled of wood smoke and fresh coffee. It was a space designed for survival and comfort, not for displaying wealth. It offered a wood-burning stove, a functional kitchen, and a wide porch facing the current. The building process healed the lingering wounds of my corporate layoff. Watching the walls rise from the dirt provided a tangible connection to the soil my grandfather loved. I stood on those wooden planks this afternoon, wearing a pair of scuffed, rugged leather boots. The air carried the crisp scent of pine needles, damp earth, and undeniable freedom. The rushing water of the Bitterroot River provided a steady, calming soundtrack. Aunt Maya parked her vehicle near the tree line and walked up the dirt path. She wore her thick wool coat guarding against the lingering spring chill. She carried a thermos of hot black coffee and 2 ceramic mugs. Her dark eyes surveyed the untamed landscape and the modest dwelling I had built. She stepped onto the porch and handed me a steaming cup. She did not speak right away. She took a slow sip of her beverage and offered a quiet, knowing smile. We watched the cold water rush over the smooth stones, continuing the eternal rhythm of the valley. The conflict required no further dialogue. The river spoke for us. My father and stepmother assumed my silence indicated weakness. They believed stripping my bank account and firing me from my job would break my resolve. They thought they could bully a young woman into handing over a generational fortune. They failed to realize that true endurance is forged in quiet observation. Meticulous documentation, unyielding patience, and a profound respect for the soil will always outlast loud, entitled greed. I raised the ceramic mug to my lips, letting the warm steam wash over my face. I looked out at the sprawling horizon, feeling the deep, enduring pulse of the Montana wilderness. I lost a stressful job in a crowded city and a superficial relationship with people who only valued my compliance. I gained an impenetrable fortress. I kept the dirt, I kept the water, I kept the legacy. The dust has long settled over the Bitterroot Valley, but the echoes of what transpired in that staged, sterile dining room still reverberate in the quietest moments of my life. When I stand on the porch of my cabin, wearing scuffed boots and watching the cold, unyielding currents of the river cut through the ancient Montana stone, I realize that the story of my family's fracture was never truly about an inheritance. It was never just about acreage or subterranean water rights or the deceptive allure of $500,000 in liquid cash. Those elements were merely the physical instruments of a much deeper, more profound collapse. The true casualty of the Crawford legacy was the fundamental failure of parenting, a catastrophic erosion of the core values that are supposed to anchor a traditional family unit. In American culture, we are frequently sold a sanitized, highly comfortable version of family responsibility. We are conditioned to believe that our primary duty as parents and guardians is to provide endlessly, to uplift without condition, and to ensure that our children never suffer the hardships or friction we might have endured. But somewhere along the line, my father Richard and my stepmother Brenda confused provision with delusion. They looked at Tyler, a young man who had been handed every advantage, every unearned luxury, and every unwarranted second chance, and they decided that loving him meant insulating him from the consequences of his own incompetence. They built an impenetrable fortress of excuses around a remarkably fragile ego. In doing so, they did not save him. They condemned him to a life of perpetual weakness. Tyler's eventual ruin, the federal indictments for wire fraud, the humiliating bankruptcy, the quiet weeping in the corner of a room he arrogantly thought he controlled, was not caused by the predatory Chicago lending syndicate. The syndicate was merely the symptom. The disease was authored by the two people who raised him. When we strip away accountability in the name of parental love, we do not cultivate strength. We cultivate a dangerous, parasitic entitlement. Richard and Brenda model the modern superficiality that willfully discarded the traditional American ethos of earning your keep. They valued the appearance of success over the grueling grit required to sustain it. By constantly sweeping Tyler's failures under a rug woven from an open checkbook, they robbed him of the vital opportunity to develop a spine. They taught him that rules were flexible, that catastrophic debts were someone else's problem to solve, and that loyalty was purely transactional. This toxic favoritism did not just ruin the golden child, it poisoned the entire ecosystem of our family. Fairness and honesty are the bedrock of any enduring healthy household. When parents choose to bend the truth to accommodate the weakest link, they actively betray the children who carry the heavy weight of responsibility. I was the responsible daughter. I worked the long hours, analyzed the dense corporate contracts, and built an independent life without ever asking for a single bailout. Yet the moment the family faced a crisis, my parents did not hesitate to harvest my stability to fuel Tyler's dysfunction. They looked at my independence not as a source of familial pride, but as an expendable resource to be exploited. The emotional awareness required to navigate a complex blended family was entirely absent in their daily calculations. They assumed my quiet endurance equated to infinite, unquestioning compliance. They lacked the emotional intelligence to recognize that a child's silence is rarely a sign of submission. It is almost always the sound of them taking inventory. They were so consumed by the deafening noise of Tyler's constant crises that they failed to see the storm brewing in the quietest person in the room. A parent's true responsibility is to see all of their children clearly, to validate the strong just as much as they support the weak. By punishing my competence to subsidize his carelessness, they broke the unwritten social contract of the family structure. They taught me that my value was conditional, tethered only to what I could sacrifice for their preferred son. My grandfather, John Crawford, understood this dynamic with terrifying, prophetic clarity. He was a man carved from the harsh, unforgiving landscape of Big Sky country. He knew that you cannot build a legacy on soft, shifting ground. His estate plan was not merely a mundane distribution of assets. It was a final, brilliant moral examination. He left the superficial wealth, the liquid cash and the cosmetic surface of the ranch within my father's reach, fully expecting him to fail the test. He understood that long-term guidance sometimes requires letting people hang themselves with their own rope. John valued the enduring truth of the earth, the deep, vital water, and the ancient timber, and he entrusted it to the only descendant who understood that true wealth must be guarded with cold, unyielding accountability. The tragedy of Richard and Brenda is that they believed they were performing an act of profound parental devotion. They genuinely thought that forging a quitclaim deed, defunding my accounts, and orchestrating a vicious whisper campaign to destroy my reputation in the local township were necessary sacrifices to save their boy. They blinded themselves to their own moral decay, wrapping their theft and deceit in the comforting rhetoric of family loyalty. But honesty cannot be compartmentalized. You cannot teach a child to be an honorable man while you are actively defrauding his sister to pay his predatory debts. Children do not listen to the noble lectures we give them. They absorb the quiet compromises we make in the shadows. Tyler learned how to be a fraud by watching the people who raised him commit fraud in his name. If these quiet reflections on the fragile nature of trust, the heavy, lingering cost of toxic favoritism, and the enduring power of truth resonate with the hidden battles in your own life, I invite you to walk this path with us. Drop a comment below with your own experiences of balancing familial loyalty and personal integrity, and be sure to subscribe to Morning Revenge. We will continue to explore the intricate, often painful dynamics of families who forget what matters, and the quiet resilience of those who are forced to remember. Looking back at the shattered wreckage of the Crawford family, the most haunting realization is not the money that was lost, the social standing that was evaporated, or even the vast acres of land that were retained. It is the startling, uncomfortable understanding of what real love actually requires. Society has conditioned us to believe that unconditional love means providing an endless, unbreakable safety net. We are taught that a good parent must catch their child every single time they stumble, shielding them from the harsh friction and painful consequences of the real world. But as I sit on the edge of the timberline, watching the river carve its permanent, undeniable path through the unforgiving rock, I realize the conventional wisdom we cling to is a comforting lie. True, enduring love is not about preventing the fall. It is about having the terrifying, counterintuitive courage to step aside and let them hit the ground. Because it is only in the crushing, agonizing impact of their own consequences that a person ever learns how to stand up on their own.